Hi. So I wanted to talk about the whole definition of cult and whether it applies to Jehovah's Witnesses. I was, in all the 35 years that I was a Jehovah's Witness, the cult comment would come up. And of course, we were always told, no, it's not a cult. That's what Satan wants people to think, which is probably exactly what you'd expect an organization to say, right? But now, I guess because my first video, I had mentioned that I wasn't sure whether it should be called a cult or not, because I hadn't really looked into it really in the last while. So since then I have, and so I wanted to share some of those things with you guys. And I know a lot of you have done a lot more research than on this subject than I have, but I feel like I'm up to date. So, being an open-minded person, I really encourage free thinking, and I think it's important to look at how a cult is defined, and keeping in mind that there's various levels, I think, of what would be recognized as a cult. And when I looked at like governmental lists of cults, it seems to be quite inconsistent between countries as to how they base their findings on what a cult is. Some look at it as, is it a violent group? The financial power of that group, also the amount of coercion or brainwashing that is used to maintain membership within that. And so there's various levels as to how different, I guess, governments define what a cult is, and whether, based on that, as to who ends up on their lists, right? So when I looked up famous cults in U.S. history, so the top 10, of course, the first one being the Manson family shows up, obvious cult, so anyways, don't need to go much further on that. Scientology is pretty much on every list that I found. Branch Davidians is also on a lot of lists as well. So the famous cults is in. Actually, I think I'll put that in my description as a link, and you guys can check that out too. So the term cult is disputed among theologians, authorities, and deprogramming experts and psychologists. So I think it's interesting to just see how everybody describes what a cult is. But going back to Jehovah's Witnesses, so when I went, because I thought, well, I want to see what they're saying about them being a cult these days. And so I went to jw.org, and I'll share that link too as to the cult, their explanation of it. And so, of course, they say, we're not a cult, but rather we're Christians who do our best to follow Jesus Christ and his teachings. And so their definition, they use 2 points as to what the perceptions around cults are that don't apply to Jehovah's Witnesses. One of them is some think of a cult as a new or unorthodox religion. So, of course, they don't feel they're new, which, I guess it depends on your opinion of what is new or unorthodox. And then the other point is some think a cult as being dangerous religious sect with a human leader. So they don't feel that they have a human leader because they follow Jesus. Jesus is their leader, right? So those are the only 2 points that they use as to why they're not a cult, which seems a little obscure to me. But anyways, they say far from being a dangerous cult, they are very helpful to its members and the community with all the work they do in helping others. And that's their definition. Okay. So, but I really wanted to look into this BITE model that a couple of you guys had said, hey, you should check this out. So I did. And I love psychology, so it just totally absorbed me. I'm like, this is amazing. And not just from the JW perspective, but just from the perspective of people getting involved in cults in the first place. And I never felt like I was part of a cult, but, let's just move on here. So now taking a look at the BITE model, so of cult mind control, and this is by Stephen Hassan. And so this is put together by deprogramming experts from all types of different cults that apply to like terrorist groups and you name it, right? The Manson family, all these types. So I'm just going to highlight the points. Like it's quite a big list as to what they apply as discussion points around being a cult, and I'll go into some of these, but I'm just going to highlight the points that I think apply to the Jehovah's Witness organization, and there's a lot more. So I will also put the link in my description as well so that you guys can check it out. So BITE, if you haven't seen it before or looked into it, BITE is actually an acronym standing for B, behavioral control, I, information control, T, thought control, and E, emotional control. And so I'll just dive into a few points on each that I think really do apply from a Jehovah's Witness perspective in their organization for each. So B, behavior control, major time spent with group indoctrination and discouragement of being individual, discourage individualism. Under behavior, also thoughts, feelings, and activities are reported to superiors. This is very common. So if you know of anybody that's being is being sinful or whatever, you are supposed to report that to the elders. Also behavior control, they install dependency and obedience. Okay, so I information control. Information to control as deception, so deliberately withholding information from the members, ensuring information at different levels is controlled, such as like an elder's manual that women especially don't ever get to see, and anybody else that isn't an elder. And I'm sure there's many others that I don't even know about that has been withheld from me over those years. Information control also is discouraging access to non-cult or non-organizational sources of information, and that includes basically anything that doesn't come from the organization. So this is, and then you use their information extensively and exclusively because you rely on the organization to give you the food at the proper time, and that's extremely common. Thought control requires members to internalize doctrine as truth. So the black and white thinking, thought control, the number one thing is the truth. Like that's instilled in us right from the very beginning as this is the truth. And so constantly referring to your religion or your organization as the truth, very much so a thought control. Rejection of critical thinking and constructive criticism, labeling alternative belief systems as illegitimate. So anything outside of the organization is Satan's world. Now moving on to emotional control, so the E in BITE. It promotes feelings of guilt, not living up to your potential, instilling fear of thinking independently, fear of the outside world, fear of losing one's salvation, and fear of being shunned if you walk away or do something that's not proper in the organization. And extreme lows and highs of emotional love bombing and praise at one moment, and then declaring that you're a sinner or shunning you in the next. And I mean, I've definitely experienced that, and I know a lot of you who are watching have as well. And then, of course, emotional control also covers the terrible consequence if you leave. So you won't receive everlasting life. You'll be shunned, disfellowshipped, and there's never a legitimate reason to leave. So if you leave, you're spiritually weak, you're unscriptural, you're worldly, etc. So that's BITE, the BITE model in a nutshell. So based on this research that I've done, and I'm sharing in my link in the links below in the description there, I do feel that Jehovah's Witnesses fall into being a cult, as the definitions are given about what a cult and mind control and thought control, behavior control, and information control. So they definitely fall into all of those categories. So yeah, sorry, JW. There's better information out there as to what makes up a cult, and I think you are one. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in, and if you like this, thumbs up, thank you, and subscribe, and we'll see you again. Cheers.